The Anarcho-Christian Podcast, evaluating the relationship between the Christian and the state.
Give us a king to rule us when you're gone. His life's work had been to help the people understand it's not the role of a man to rule over other men.
Today I have a special treat for you guys. I have Elijah Henry from Everything Voluntary and Freedom with Responsibility in Our Time, and we are going to go over his journey into voluntarism with his article, How an Airborne Ranger Became a Voluntarist. Hey everybody, welcome back to the show. I'm very happy to have with me Elijah Henry, and he has written an article titled How an Airborne Ranger Became a Voluntarist. And when I read that, I knew that we had to have this conversation on the show. And Elijah, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me on here, Stephen. I appreciate it.
Again, so your article that caught my attention was How an Airborne Ranger Became a Voluntarist. And I believe that it was first posted on everythingvoluntary.com. Is that correct?
No, it was actually posted first on Voluntaryist.com.
Oh, okay.
And later I got more of a platform on everythingvoluntary.com, and I've published a few more articles on there. I have a blog on there, and I publish articles occasionally. Nothing very recent, but I have a number of articles on there. You can find it on the Freedom with Responsibility blog on that website.
Excellent. So your article here, I think, one thing that caught my attention, we see a lot of articles just in our circles of people writing about their journey to becoming a voluntarist. But one thing you don't normally see are the words Airborne Ranger and Voluntarist in the same headline. And
for sure.
And so that's what caught my attention. I think that's what's caught a lot of people's attention, and I appreciate you letting us rerun it on anarchochristian.com.
No problem.
Because I see in here that your faith has a lot to do with it.
It does, for sure. Yeah, my relationship with God informs everything that I do. I'm not perfect by any means, but it definitely guides me through my life, and definitely is the foundation for my belief system.
So I guess let's back up, and can you walk us through this journey a little bit? What took you, to becoming an Airborne Ranger, and then what brought you to voluntarism?
Sure. So becoming an Airborne Ranger, I served in the 75th Ranger Regiment for a little over a year. Growing up, I always wanted to be a combat special operations soldier. I kind of went back and forth at various times between wanting to go the Special Forces route and wanting to go the Airborne Ranger route. And I did that even once I was in the Army. I enlisted and planning to go. Well, I tried to enlist to go Special Forces. They didn't have the slots available at that time, so I got a contract to go to the Ranger Regiment. And then while I was in basic training, I had the opportunity to drop the Ranger contract and pick up the Special Forces contract. So I did that. Then I started into the Special Forces pipeline, and I didn't get very far. I broke my femur, a stress fracture in my femur near the hip. In airborne school, I was able to complete airborne school in spite of the injury, but when I got to the next step, I was medically dropped and I was unable to continue. That took a little over a year to heal, so it was pretty serious, even though I was able to work through it. So I was out of the pipeline for Special Forces, but I was able to then go to the Ranger selection program, and I did complete that, and because I completed it, I went into the 75th Ranger Regiment. And as I said, I was there for a little over a year. before moving on to the 82nd Airborne Division. But I feel like God puts desires in our heart because he wants us to go somewhere for a reason. And I think God did want me to have the military journey that I had. And I do believe that desire came from him. I think that may have been to give me credibility now. I don't know. There's probably a lot more to that than just that. But I know now, you hear the question and discussion is, well, have you served? Well, yes, I did. And I served, I served in the Ranger Regiment. I did some hard stuff. But that does give me credibility with a certain group of people that I think definitely helps me.
Yeah.
But as far as my motivations for joining the Ranger Regiment or trying to become Special Forces, they changed over the years. Like I said, I wanted to do that since I was a kid. Would go back and forth between them. I was like, man, Special Forces sounds really cool. Like they're the best of the best. And then my uncle's like, well, if you want to actually do the fighting, Special Forces does that a little bit, but the Rangers are the real fighters there. I'm like, well, man, that's really what I want to do. So we kind of went back and forth. Both are, exceptional individuals, but I think the desire did come from God, and my motivations changed over time. Like I had different routes that I wanted to take with my life. And when I joined the military, my idea was to get experience in special operations, especially special forces. And eventually when I get out, help revitalize the constitutional militia. It's an institution of government. It's in the Constitution and it's largely ignored. I think it's one of the best parts of the Constitution, but it hasn't really been a thing for over a century. And I felt that it would be really beneficial for constitutional rule of law and national security to get the system going again, where every male from 16 to 60 has to have a gun and ammunition and stuff he needs to go to war and train on a regular basis, and have everybody prepared to actually defend themselves and their country. I still think there's a lot of positive aspect to that, but that's certainly not my goal now. I think that's something people should just do on their own.
Right.
I'm not necessarily saying to start a militia. It isn't where I was going with that anyway. But people should be prepared to defend themselves and their family.
Well, and at what point, I guess, in your philosophical journey into libertarianism or voluntarism, did some of this stuff start to come into conflict? Was it while you were injured, while you were training? At what point, was it kind of in this timeline?
Sure. I would say, I grew up as a Republican, became more of a constitutionalist when I was in college. That's why I was trying to get the government institution of the constitutional militia going again. And I started trending more towards libertarianism after college. So that was while I was in the military. And I was still mainly a constitutionalist, but let's see, it wasn't really during my injury. It wasn't until I was in the Ranger Regiment I started thinking, what makes taxation not theft? Like I would ask that kind of rhetorically. And I wasn't really saying it was theft. I was like, what makes it not theft? I don't know.
Right.
Is it theft? Yeah. Is it theft? Isn't it? I found an article that I think has some merit. It points out, when you say taxation is theft, that alone doesn't necessarily mean that it's completely wrong. Theft isn't necessarily always wrong. If you see a kid drowning in a lake and you need to steal a boat to rescue the kid, you're stealing. You're definitely stealing. You're taking somebody's boat without permission, but you're not doing wrong. So saying that taxation is theft just by itself, that's just really raising the moral bar. It's not saying you can't steal necessarily, but it is saying you need to have a really compelling moral reason to do so. And I thought that was a good point at the time. I still think it has some merit, but yeah, while I was in the Ranger Regiment and I was transitioning from the Ranger Regiment, I had a couple of friends who were libertarians, more or less than I was, and we would talk about that stuff. That's the point that I was at that time, just asking what makes taxation not theft. Mm-hmm. When I got to the 82nd Airborne Division, I'd been there a few months, and I was still planning to be in the Army for a lot longer. I actually re-enlisted and extended my contract right before I left the regiment because I was planning to commission, become an officer, and continue to do more high-speed stuff. But after a couple of months there, it really came to me, when did God ever say that we needed to make governments? You can say that they're ordained of God, and that's something to consider, but did he ever actually tell us to make them? I mean, people are making them. People do that all throughout history, but did God ever tell us to? Right. And if he didn't tell us to, then what are the implications of that? And I started studying the Bible with that in mind. And I came to the conclusion God never did tell us to create governments.
I agree that that's something that I think that when we read verses about governments, people can make that assumption. But you're right. You're not going to find anything in there commanding it to be done. And
yeah, for sure.
And some of the things that you touched on there with taxation, is it theft? Comparing it to taking a boat to help someone in need. That is something that as Christians who are honestly working through these issues, we know that we do need to be charitable and support people. But how does that work when we start getting into these very individualistic philosophies, with that are wrapped around libertarianism and voluntarism, and it can be a lot to work through, I think, and it looks like you and some of your friends here that you guys were doing that together, kind of walking through that together.
Yeah, we had discussions, and I think they're both pretty well anarchist at this point, as am I. Of course, we know anarchist kind of has the term has some baggage, but so does the term capitalist, and so does the term Christian. Mm-hmm. So, some people like to use it, and people have different strategies with that, but I'm okay with it. It's not my favorite term. But talking about what God says about creating governments, the closest thing that I could find is in the Old Testament law, when he said that the Israelites needed to choose judges and officers. And as far as I could tell from my study of the word officers, it seemed to be referring to militia officers. They did have a militia system, and it was better than the American system. It was voluntary. We know God is just and wise, wiser than we are with what we can come up with. So he allowed people, everybody was expected to serve, but if you were the least little bit afraid, he said, go home. We don't need you defending everybody if you're afraid. There were a number of other exceptions. If you just got married, if you just bought a piece of land or whatever, you were excluded from the requirement for military service. Well, making an exception for being afraid, that's straight up voluntary. You can just say, I'm afraid, and you don't have to fight. That's as voluntary as it gets. I believe that God does want us to have a system of defense. I think a militia system is really good because it involves personal responsibility. You can hire security guards, but when it comes down to it, you are responsible to God for being a steward of your own life. I believe that involves being prepared to defend yourself if you possibly can. So I think that a militia system where you network with other people and you all are responsible to each other for collective defense, I think that's a very positive thing. And then the judicial system, we're all familiar with the judges of the Old Testament,
Mm-hmm.
and they were, it's not exactly clear how it all worked, but they seem to be volunteers. People just went to them because they knew they were the wisest people around who could render good decisions. They do not seem to have been funded by taxes or coercion of any kind. And I think that's a great way to do it. Usually people who have thought about anarchism a little bit, they're like, their question is, what about national defense? What about the justice system? If they get past, who would supply roads, like, well, what about defense? What about judges, courts, and all that? Well, I think that these things can be provided very well by a voluntary system. I think that I think Israel had a pretty good model for that, and I think it could be adapted and applied today.
Yeah, it's definitely something that is a little bit further down the discussion than just roads. But there are answers to that. There are answers on how we can supply, arbitration and defense as for your personal property or even for large communities. And I do think it's interesting that we have some biblical examples as well, because that's something that I think is not noticed a lot when people start talking about the Bible. We jump straight to Romans 13, but we don't look at prior to Samuel or First Samuel when we have the institution of the kings over Israel. We don't do a lot of looking toward prior to that.
Right. Yeah. Christians like to jump to Romans 13, but I think that the Bible is the best commentary on the Bible, and you should look at the whole Bible and see what it actually says about the entire matter that you're considering. I was taught in my political science degree, my undergraduate degree, that government was instituted by God in Genesis 9 when God instituted capital punishment. And even then, I was kind of questioning about that because it doesn't say anything about civil government in the text. It just says, to paraphrase, if a man sheds blood, a man kills somebody, then, he has to die. By man shall his blood be shed. So that's capital punishment, but it doesn't say civil government has to do that. You look at Israel, they had stoning. That was a community punishment. They didn't have an institution like we think of today where it's funded by taxes and you have a dedicated executioner and all that. When somebody had to die, the whole community was responsible for making sure that happened. And the first person to cast the stones were the witnesses who were condemning him. You had to have 2 or 3 witnesses to prove that he had done an offense worthy of capital punishment, and then they had to back it up by actually being willing to inflict the punishment themselves. I think God was very wise in instituting that.
Yeah, it puts a lot more responsibility on the people, which is something that I think we lose sight of when we've created a large government central entity that we can kind of just push off any of our problems onto the police or the court systems with this kind of faceless entity that protects us.
Yeah, for sure.
So one thing that I was also interested in, you mentioned earlier, and it's the "Have you served?" Question that people get, and it's unfortunate that does seem to be the only way that someone can be critical of a large defense force, and also giving your opinion on having a privatized police force and things like that. It's unfortunate that is kind of a go-to question. However, how have you been able to, I guess, use that to kind of diffuse sometimes I'm sure that the hostility that kind of comes with some of these topics? How have you been able to use your service to get some of these ideas across without some of the fighting that might go along with it?
Sure. Well, part of it is just through this article that we've been talking about that inspired this episode. Just putting that out there, letting people know, this is what I believe. This is how I came to this belief, and that's where I came from. There are a lot of online discussions, and when it's not something that I flaunt, but when it comes up, if it's relevant, if I think it would make a difference to the person that I'm talking to, I'll be like, yeah, I'm a veteran. I was infantry. I was an Airborne Ranger. And yeah, this is what I believe about that. And it's given me some credibility with people that I probably wouldn't have otherwise had credibility with.
And the credibility that it does give you is even more so than just someone who's enlisted, but maybe hadn't been to some of the schools that you've seen. In the sense of how we view the military and the service, Airborne Ranger, that's pretty much as high as it goes. There's a gentleman I'm sure you're very familiar with is Smedley Butler. And
yeah.
It's interesting to use his quotes, but then when you tag, Major General, USMC, highly decorated, I think that it sort of changes the way that those words and the meaning behind them. It kind of changes the way that it's delivered, or at least the way that it's received.
Yeah, for sure. I still need to get around to reading his book, but yeah, he has some excellent quotations. And wasn't he a 2-time Medal of Honor recipient? I think 2-star general. Yeah, and 2 Medals of Honor. That's of course extraordinary. Only been a handful of men in history who have gotten that honor twice, and it's great that he wrote that to help people understand what's actually going on.
I'm wondering with your faith aspect of all of this, did you go into the service, as a Christian, or was that something that maybe came along later?
Yes, I was a Christian when I joined the Army. I was saved when I was about 5 years old. I grew up in a Christian home. I graduated from a Christian high school and graduated from a Christian college. And a couple of weeks after graduation, went to Army basic training. So yeah, I was a Christian the whole time. But obviously I've grown in my understanding of the Bible over time.
Absolutely. We all do.
Sure.
Were there any moments specifically during your conversion to voluntarism and really examining your faith? Was there anything particularly that you saw either in your studies or in your training or in the world's foreign policy? What was it that I guess got you to really start examining your faith, as it was before you went in, and then really comparing your faith to these other philosophies like voluntarism?
Sure. See, I don't remember what precipitated the question, but I remember I was chewing on it for a couple of days, and I remember bringing it up to my wife on the way home from church one day. I think we talked about this earlier. When did God tell us, or did God tell us to make governments? And I was thinking, I've read the Bible through multiple times. I've heard it heard the Bible preached in church thousands of times. I pretty well know the answer. I'm like, it's not in there, but I'm going to start studying this to see if I can find it.
Yeah.
We're generally told that God made three institutions. He made the family, he made the church, and he made the government. Well, it's noteworthy that God was physically present when he made the family, and he was physically present when he made the church. And if he instituted government, well, there's nowhere that it shows him being physically present for that. So that, he wouldn't necessarily have to do it that way for a third institution, but it should certainly raise some questions for the other two that he definitely instituted. And, why wasn't he physically present for instituting government? If he's got these three institutions that are supposed to take care of everything in the world, all the responsibilities are supposed to be divided between family, church, and government. So I was always told, then, why didn't he take the time to be physically present for that too?
That is an interesting thought. I've never thought of that. During this, did you have any pushback from your family or friends or your church?
Well, let's see. For my wife she is able to, follow the line of thinking, and she understands it. So she's with me on that. But let's see, the rest of my family, my parents, they are not anarchists. They're still Republicans, and I don't think they're going to change. But I wouldn't say they're necessarily upset with the development of my thoughts.
Yeah.
Yeah, my other siblings are not so much affected by it. Let's see, for my church, of course, I got out of the Army a few months ago, so we are not going to the same church that we were then.
Did you attend a church on the facility, or did you attend one outside of the military base?
It was a local Baptist church, not on base. They're pretty, being a church that serves the military there, they are, typical of what you would expect, pretty solidly Republican, pretty solidly pro-military and pro-government. What church we're going to now, we haven't actually joined it yet, but when we've been attending, they're pretty similar. Had some discussions with them, got some wide eyes when I pointed out that everything that Samuel warned about, picking a monarchy or King Saul over God, everything that he warned about, that happens with every other government in history too. And they were pretty amazed by that, but don't know how much I can change their minds, but definitely put some thoughts in people's heads.
Yeah, and sometimes that's just what it's all about, right? It looks like everyone around you is already very much into the Republican, the right leaning rhetoric of liberty and freedom and Christianity, and so sometimes these words and these concepts, presenting it to them, they'll say, yeah, that sounds good, that sounds right, but then when you kind of present that leap, in their minds, it's a leap maybe, but to us, it's just the natural flow of it. But
Right.
when you present that leap, they can't go there.
Right. Yeah, everybody agrees that the government sucks, but everybody still thinks that we need the government.
Right. And it's just something that I think is it's going to be never ending. I think that that's always going to be there. That's my personal belief. So no need in getting into a fight over it. Let's
Sure.
we know that we hold the truth, and we know that we hold the consistent understanding.
Right.
So if we just keep presenting that.
Sure. I know I said earlier, I don't know how many minds I can change. That's not really what I'm setting out to do. I want to ask questions that get people to, think for themselves. And if you get people thinking, they'll eventually come to the right conclusion. But the problem is that people aren't thinking. They just, they're parroting what they've heard and just assuming things are the way they've been told.
Yeah, and I agree that sometimes it's just asking those questions,
Right.
and most people will, I think, sort of reflect back on it. And, when we do have those answers, though, for those questions, I think that they'll listen, be it just the philosophy of doing something as a stateless society or even the biblical consistencies of not initiating force against other people. I think that like you're saying, you put those questions out there and you get people to start thinking, and that really is a great way to introduce some of these concepts and some of the logical conclusions that we have to introduce that to people.
Sure.
Well, I really appreciate your time. That really is, everything that I hope to touch on. And so if you wouldn't mind, take the next little while to explain to the audience where they can find you, where they can read more of your material. And, and again, I really appreciate your time.
Sure. So I have a few things going on. I have the Freedom with Responsibility blog on everythingvoluntary.com. That's everything-voluntary.com. Look under the blogs heading, find the part of the alphabet that has Freedom with Responsibility in it, and you can find a number of articles by me. I have a Facebook page called Freedom with Responsibility in Our Time. And mostly I share awesome memes that I find elsewhere, but I do get some original content out sometimes. And also check out Liberland Press. I am the editor-in-chief of Liberland Press, which is the national news source for Liberland. I know it's kind of ironic, an anarchist helping a country get started, and I have no illusions that Liberland will be free forever, but I think that it can be beneficial. So I'm trying to help that get going and see if we can get a country going without taxes. It has some of the framework of a normal state, but we try to minimize that. It's just for appearances, really. So we're going to see where that takes us. But check out those 3 places, and I appreciate your having me on here.
Well, I hope you guys like that. I hope you learned something. I know I did. And I'm very thankful to Elijah for coming on and giving us his story about becoming an Airborne Ranger and becoming a voluntarist. And I think that he gave us a lot of good stuff to think about, a lot of stuff to chew on and to research, and just to kind of see his journey and how he got there, and how we can use that in discussing things with our friends and our family who may not be there. They may not be at that point where they can really agree with where we take our voluntarist logic, where we take our philosophy, but maybe it can help you hone in on some of those things like liberty and this idea of free and voluntary societies without coercion and responsibility for ourselves and our families and our neighbor. So I appreciate you checking out this episode, and if you like what we're doing, please consider leaving a 5-star rating and review on iTunes. That'll help us get more listeners and grow the show. Also, if you are enjoying the podcast, please consider becoming a patron through Patreon. If you go to anarchochristian.com/support, that'll take you to our Patreon page where you'll see a few ways that you could support us. And also, don't forget to hit that subscribe button on whatever podcatcher you're using. We're on iTunes, YouTube, Google Play, Stitcher, Spotify, you name it, we're there. Go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss any episodes. And with that, grace and peace, no king but Christ.
He cried out to God, won't you help them to believe? This power is illusion, the need to rule is greed. Your love and your light is really all they need. It's really all we need.
Thank you for listening to the Anarcho-Christian Podcast. Subscribe to our email notifications at anarchochristian.com, like us on facebook.com/anarchochristian, and follow us on Twitter at anarchoxp. Subscribe to our podcast and YouTube to join us next time as we continue to evaluate the relationship between the Christian and the state. No king but Christ.
This has been a Pax Libertas Productions podcast.